Okay, so any questions about what the basic arguments are? Either you didn't. I have another video here. I'm debating which one of these two to show you. I picked this one, I guess, ultimately because it was a minute shorter. This one here has someone arguing the other side of the issue.
Yeah,
okay. Maybe a little, but you know, it may also be because they judge that the news editors maybe judge that the arguments supporting photo ID laws are pretty straightforward. Pretty you know, straightforward in terms of how they're articulated, attempt to prevent voter fraud.
So without the form of ID, how would they prevent voter fraud?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand what you're asking, but I will.
But like if like you don't need any form of ID when you go and vote.
Well,
how else would they prevent voter fraud?
How many election cycles did we have before 2013 where there were no photo ID laws, and there still is no real evidence of voter fraud?
And then we had a lot of voter fraud.
Look, and I think what Eric Holder's argument is, and you know, again, you can accept it or reject it, is that it's a constitutional right. You don't have to show an ID to be able to exercise your constitutional right of free speech. You don't have to show a photo ID in order to exercise your constitutional right to peaceably assemble. You don't have to show a photo ID to exercise any other constitutional right. Why are we trying to impose this restriction, he's saying, on this particular constitutional right? What's the motivation?
You have to have a license to conceal carry.
To conceal carry, you don't have to have a license to own a gun.
But to conceal carry, you do, which is not known as infringement.
There are no civil liberties rights under our Constitution that we as a society have ever recognized as being absolute. We recognize that in each case that as a civilized society, we can place reasonable restrictions. For example, your right to free speech, which I used a moment ago, so you don't have to show a photo ID to exercise your right of free speech. There are still restrictions on the right of free speech. You can't say anything you want, anytime you want, under any circumstance you want. You can't drive through a residential neighborhood at 3 a.m. blaring some message over a public address system, waking up all the neighbors and whipping the dogs into a frenzy. And when the police come and slap a citation on you for disturbing the peace, say, oh, wait a minute, I got a right of free speech. You're not, well, you can make that argument, but you're not going to prevail in court, right? Because we have always recognized that as a civilized society, we can place certain restrictions, reasonable restrictions on the right of free speech. Just like we can place reasonable restrictions on the right of free worship, just like we can impose reasonable restrictions on the right to privacy, just like we can impose reasonable restrictions on the right to keep and bear arms.
We can keep arms, but we have a restriction on what kind of.
It doesn't mean that you don't retain the right. It just means that there's going to be some restrictions on it. You can't do anything you want. Does the right to keep and bear arms, for example, mean that I can get a Patriot missile battery and put it in my backyard,
No.
or an anti-tank gun and put it in my front yard and claim, oh, I've got the right to, that's an arm, right? It's armament, right?
I have the right. I have the new.
I don't want to make it
Well, who would try to
argument
do
too
that?
ridiculous.
Well, yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
Well, good luck trying to take a nuke. I mean, what are they going to do?
Yeah, but again, this is, again, I'm not suggesting to you that you have to accept that argument or that is even the correct argument. I think the argument against photo ID laws is a little bit harder for people to, it's a little bit more nuanced than the argument in support of it. The argument in support of photo ID laws seems to be very straightforward. We don't want people voting who aren't supposed to be voting. We're trying to prevent voter fraud. How much more straightforward? There's really no nuance to that argument. But there is nuance to the argument that, yes, but if you require people to get IDs, that it may not be really very easy for some people to get. It may end up, there may be a pattern in terms of who you prevent from voting as a result. And you may end up, they are saying that the current situation in Texas is it's probably going to mean largely Latinos.
One question,
Mhm.
just for clarification, so when you go to vote, what do you, what documents do you show before you vote?
Well, now in Texas, the law is in place. You have to show a photo ID. Now, there was a, subsequent to the video report that you actually saw, the Texas legislature authorized the law. And there was a lawsuit against the state of Texas that went to a district court, didn't go to the United States Supreme Court, went to a district court. And the district court ordered the state to allow for a wider variety of substitute IDs. For example,
You use your passport, your driver's.
well, those are photo IDs. Okay, so like, let's say somebody doesn't have photo ID. Can, for example, you bring a utility bill that has your address on it? Yes, the answer is yes. You
Wow.
laugh, but the answer is yes. That the court's saying, look, there are certain people who, it's not, easy for some people to get these IDs. So if the goal of the law is to make sure that the person who is casting the vote is actually the person who says that they are, then maybe something like a utility bill that has your address, they put the address, oh yes, it's in the precinct that you're voting in. You have some other form of corroborating ID. You might have to present two things. Like if you didn't have the photo ID, you might have, I think under Texas law, you have to, if you don't have one of the approved photo IDs, you have to have at least two, it may be three other things like a utility bill and, other kinds of documentation that demonstrates that you are who you say you are. So the court said, okay, well, that is a way to, make it possible for people who don't have these forms of ID and can't easily get these forms. And do you all buy the argument that in some parts of Texas, it might be exceedingly difficult for some people to get these IDs?
Yes,
Right.
long waits. and
Long distances?
Long
Yeah.
distances, long waits when you get there, you gotta make an appointment. Maybe you can't sit there all day and sacrifice your work day. Yeah, there's a lot of barriers.
But I'm just saying though, there are a lot of people who have driver licenses. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have expanded it, I'm just saying there are a lot of people who have driver licenses. There are people who don't.
Does the Texas driver's license indicate whether you are a citizen?
No.
No, you cannot get it if you're not.
You can't get,
If you're not a resident or a citizen, you cannot.
no, but being a resident is different than being a citizen. Right? You have to be a citizen to vote.
If you're
Yes.
registered.
You don't have to be a citizen to get a driver's license, right? So does the Texas driver's license indicate
Nope.
that Joe Problem, who has a driver's license, name matches up with the photo, right, is actually a citizen? It does, I don't,
There's a lot of people.
so how's that,
Interesting.
preventing voter fraud?
April, a couple of house codes, we just get it. You ever been to the DMV?
Try to stay out.
Try to stay away from it.
There's a lot more we can say here, obviously, but in the interest of time, there's some things we have to get to. So let's move on. Talk about some things that are a little bit less controversial, I think. All the stuff over here, I'm just going to leave aside. I want to talk a little bit about the different types of elections that we have in Texas. We have about 30 minutes, a little less than 30 minutes. So I'm going to be very choosy about what we cover here. Let me begin by suggesting that there are two basic types of elections in Texas for offices, and mainly for offices. There are those offices that are elected on a partisan basis, that is to say, where the candidates run as nominees of political parties. That's this here. And then there are nonpartisan elections, which are mainly for things like city offices, like mayor and city council. But school boards, for example, candidates who run for the school board, the Fort Bend Independent School District School Board, or the Lamar Consolidated School, they don't run as Democrats or Republicans. Okay? In Texas, city elections, municipal elections, and special district elections. School districts are called what we call special districts, are nonpartisan. And then elections over constitutional referenda are nonpartisan.
Was that
Yeah,
opposite?
well, you all should actually know what I mean by that, because before the freeze, we had the topic on the Texas Constitution. We talked a lot about constitutional referendum, okay? So when voters are called to the polls to vote on this issue or that
Oh, yeah,
issue,
yeah.
it doesn't identify a Democratic position or a Republican position.
Like the lottery.
It's just, yeah,
Your position on that.
Y'all want vote? You want the lottery? All right.
okay, so elections for governor and US Senate and US House of Representatives and state attorney general, all the statewide offices and all the county offices. County judge, county commissioners, sheriff,
The police.
those are all partisan based. They all run as candidates of a political party, nominees of a political party, okay? So let's take up the partisan elections first, because that's most of them.
Even the sheriff?
The sheriff runs as a
Yeah, yeah.
nominee of a political party. Anybody know who the sheriff is of Fort Bend County?
Is it still Troy Nels or is it? or-
Troy Nels.
I know who.
Troy
Yeah,
Nels
Harris.
did not run for re-election for sheriff. He ran for the United States Congress and won.
Right. I think.
Eric Fagan,
I think, yeah.
no?
I
Is
see
he a-
the Harris one on.
Is he a Republican or a Democrat?
Was it Democrat?
He's a Democrat.
Yeah.
Troy Nels was a Republican.
I heard that Fort Bend was mainly Democrat as well.
It's been trending that way, yeah. Okay? All right, so let's talk about partisan elections first, and you can see there that I've indicated there are two different items that we need to be familiar with here. The election cycle for partisan-based offices occurs in two stages, a nomination phase and a general election. And the way that the parties nominate their candidates is through the use of primaries. I wonder why there's no eraser in here. Through the use of primaries. Okay. Now, whether we're talking about, whatever the office it is that we're talking about, whether it is U.S. Senator, U.S. Representative, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, Attorney General, all those statewide offices, okay? Those all use what we call a direct primary. So you start with a field of Republicans who want to be governor, okay? And you got to get down to just one Republican. You got to start with a field of Democrats that want to be governor. It might be as few as 2 or 3, but it might, in some years, it might be 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever the case is, right? So each party, Democratic Party, Republican Party, there are minor parties too, but the works a little bit differently. We're going to, just in the interest of time, just talk about the Democratic and Republican Party. They have to have a way to get from that field of 6 candidates, let's say, to just one candidate. And the way that they do that is by running a direct primary, okay? So what happens in a direct primary? Well, Democratic voters go to the Democratic Party primary and they cast their votes for their preferred candidate. And at the end of the day, after the voting, there's an early voting period in Texas, right? But at the end of election day, the votes are counted and the candidate who gets a majority becomes the party's nominee.
We nominate this person.
Yes.
Basically, if you're gonna vote for someone, vote on this, it helps
Yep.
keep their power on one person so they don't get separated.
What does a majority mean?
The
51%.
larger.
Well, very close.
Oh, 50.
Okay, just to be real precise, half plus 1.
Oh, okay.
Okay, it could be less than
Yeah,
51%.
yeah, half plus
It could be
one.
50.002 or something like that. Okay, so at least half plus 1. That's important because if you have more than 2 candidates, there's a chance that no one gets a majority.
Correct.
So if no one gets a majority, you have to have
A runoff.
a runoff. Good.
I know some things.
The 2 highest vote getters are gonna square off in a runoff primary, and when you only have 2 candidates, one of the 2 is gonna get a majority. Okay? What we mean by a direct primary is that the votes that are cast by Democrats, people who are voting in the Democratic primary, ordinary voters, or people who are voting in the Republican primary, ordinary voters, are what determines who the party's nominee is going to be. It's direct. It's just about the numbers. It's just about counting the votes. Okay? So that applies to all party-based offices except the presidency. So we have to have a different kind of primary called a presidential preference primary. So in a presidential preference primary, this is at a state level, Texas primary, Arizona primary, New Hampshire primary, whatever the state is. Republican voters are going to go vote for their preferred candidate. Democratic candidates are going to go vote for their preferred candidate. And when they cast that vote, it's not actually a vote directly for the candidate. It's for delegates who are pledged to that candidate, who are going to go to a national convention in the summer, and the national convention delegates are actually going to select the presidential candidate for the party. It happens that way in both the Democratic and Republican Party. Trying to give you the simplest version of this I can. It's really pretty complicated, okay? One of the reasons it's very complicated is because some states use primaries. We're talking about the presidency. Some states use primaries, exclusively use presidential preference primaries. Other states use what are called caucuses. Other states use a combination of primaries and caucuses. It differs between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and it differs from one presidential election year to the next. The rules in 2020 weren't the same as the rules were in 2016, which weren't the same as they were in 2012. You understand what I'm saying? It's very difficult to generalize about this process. But the main thing that you need to know is that it's a representative process. It's not a direct process. When you went to vote, anybody voted in the primaries in 2020? Do you want to tell us? Well, you don't have to. Don't feel obligated. If you want to, you can tell us which party's primary you voted in. If nobody wants to offer that information, I tell you what, I want us to sign something, right? We have a student, a hypothetical student here, and she tells us that she voted in the Democratic Party primary, okay? And we say to her, you want to tell us who you voted for? And she said, sure, I voted for Mike Bloomberg. Because remember, there were a lot of Democrats who wanted the party's nomination. There was Joe Biden, there was Mike Bloomberg, there was Bernie Sanders, there was, anybody remember who all, there was like 13 or 14 of them. Beto O'Rourke dropped out pretty early. Who? Kamala Harris. Huh? Okay, right here. I'm being literal. There were like 14 of them at the earliest, the earliest junction. Okay, so when this hypothetical student went to go vote for, who did I say she voted for?
Mike Bloomberg.
Oh, when she went to go vote for Mike Bloomberg, she wasn't really voting for Mike Bloomberg. She was voting for delegates who are pledged to Mike Bloomberg. Okay? And then those delegates are going to cast their vote at the national convention. Okay? Now, the way that it works in practice is that it's effectively the vote of ordinary voters in the primaries that determines the votes of the delegates at the national convention. That's why we can predict who the Republican nominee is going to be and who the Democratic Party's nominee is going to be before the delegates ever convene at their convention. We knew that Joe Biden was going to be the Democratic Party nominee before the Democrats convened last summer in their virtual convention, okay? We knew that Donald Trump was going to be the Republican nominee 4 years before it. But, I mean, he still went through that process. Actually, the Republicans canceled it, if you remember. They started that process, and then they just decided to cancel it.
I mean, he's already sitting president.
Yeah, but in every other case before that, when we've had an incumbent president, they've had to go through that process. For example, when Barack Obama ran for re-election in 2012, the Democratic Party still had its primaries when he was running for re-election. He just didn't have any credible opponents.
So if you had them, you would have.
There actually were a couple of opponents that Donald Trump had. The former governor of Ohio, John Kasich, declared his candidacy, that he wanted to challenge Donald Trump for the Republican nomination, and the former governor of Massachusetts, William Weld. And Trump, with his stranglehold grip on the Republican Party, just basically said, no, we're going to cancel the primaries. I'm not making it up. You can go back and check the news account.
No.
Yeah, elections.
Anyway, I don't want to digress too much on that point because it's kind of just a side note and a historical note. Yeah.
Technically, it's not part of the government, it's a political party. Technically, they can do that without, I'm just making sure that.
That's partly true. It's, the parties do have a lot to say about their own rules, but there is a right to vote issue that's implicated, particularly because it's something that voters have become accustomed to for many, many, many years, that the parties have gone through this process, even when they have an incumbent running for office. So I think there were some issues raised by the supporters of John Kasich and the supporters of William Weld that voting rights were being implicated by, the voters in Michigan or the voters in, whatever, they're having their votes taken away from them by the cancellation of these primaries. Okay. All right. So anyway, as I said, I don't want to digress too much on that. The main point I'm trying to make to you is that there's a difference between a direct primary, which is for all offices except for the presidency. For the presidency, we have these presidential preference primaries, which is the votes that you and I cast are not actually for the candidate, whether we're aware of it or not. They are actually for delegates to a convention. It sort of mirrors the electoral college process because, as most of you probably know, when you vote in the general election for president, you're not actually voting for the presidential candidate. You're voting for electors who will then vote for the candidate. All right? Depending on which candidate wins the popular vote in the state. So, for example, if you voted for Donald Trump in the general election in 2020, what you're actually voting for are 38 Republican electors who are going to go to Austin in December of 2020 and cast their votes for Donald Trump if Donald Trump wins the popular vote in Texas, which he did. Donald Trump won the popular vote in Texas, so the 38 electors selected by the Texas Republican Party go to Austin to cast their votes. If you're in California and you vote for Joe Biden, you're actually voting for 55 Democratic electors who are selected by the California Democratic Party to go to Sacramento in December and cast their votes for president. Okay, that's as simple as I can put it.
That's a bunch of weird, hoopla.
If it was just by population, California, Texas, Florida, and New York would pretty much own the election. This evens it out there.
There are arguments that people make both for and against the Electoral College. Again, all I'm really trying to get you to understand is not so much about the Electoral College, but about how the primary process for the presidency, nominating the presidential candidates by the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, kind of mirrors that Electoral College. It's not exactly the same, but it's close. I mean, it's a similar idea. It's a representative process. You're voting for somebody else to vote, to cast your vote for you, is kind of a way to think about it. Okay? All right. Now, let me just make this point here real quick, because I think this is kind of important. When you talk about how politics can be complicated, our system of government and politics is complicated. In addition to this distinction that I'm making between direct primaries and presidential primaries, we also need to make the distinction between closed primaries, open primaries, and something called blanket primary.
Like,
A closed primary, the basic idea is that only people who are members of the political party can vote. It's closed to people who aren't members of the political party. Now, that's a very loose membership, because in the United States, how do you become a member of a political party? Oh, basically by saying I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, and then going and voting in their primary. You don't have to pay like a membership due or anything like that. You don't have to fill out an application, right? So saying it's only open to members of the party is a very, very loose membership.
So
right?
if I was like, oh, I'm a Republican, I guess, lost into the Republican primary.
Yes.
What the?
Yes. Now, in some places in Texas, the Democrats and the Republicans are gonna hold their primary in the same place. In the same location, physical location. In other parts of Texas,
That makes sense.
they're separate, okay? So if you're in one of those other parts of Texas, if you go to the First Presbyterian Church where the Democrats are holding their primary, and you go in and ask for a ballot, anyone who sees you knows that you're voting in the Democratic Party primary. Oh, I didn't know he was a Democrat. Keep my kids away from him.
Yeah.
Huh? If you go to the First Baptist Church where the Republicans are holding their primary, anybody sees you go in and cast a vote, they know you're voting in the Republican primary. So you're declaring a party affiliation.
It's funny how it's religion too.
Well, in
Yeah.
rural counties in
Different-
Texas, it may still be done that
different
way. In a place like Fort Bend County, it's usually in a public building, like say a library or school or something like that, okay? And it used to be not that long ago that even in a place like Fort Bend County, like you went to the fire station, they might have had two different tables. Like, you know, the Democrats vote over here and the Republicans vote over here. Now you just go up to, the way that it works in Fort Bend County, I think in most precincts is that you just go up there and you say, okay, I wanna vote in the primary. Who voted in the primary in 2020? What's the first question they ask? Well, after they get your photo ID and all that kind of stuff, what do they ask you?
I'm pretty sure they asked the voting party.
Do you want to vote in the Republican primary? Or do you want to vote in the Democratic primary? And you say, I want to vote in the whatever primary, right? Everybody's saying, oh, voting in that party, right? So you're still declaring a party affiliation. And you're only voting in one of the two. You can't vote in both. That is what we mean by a closed primary. You can't go to vote in the Democratic Party primary and say, oh, you know what, now I'm going to vote in the Republican primary.
But if they're in two different locations, I can still do that.
Well, they're gonna know if you voted in the other location.
Because there'll be a timestamp as well as
Yeah.
electronic, so they would all probably already know.
And in the old days, before electronic timestamps, they would stamp your registration card. You present your registration card, voted in the Republican primary. Then you go march over to the Democratic primary, go over to the First Presbyterian Church, and I want to vote the Democratic. So I actually had a student, you know what? I had a student, I'll always remember this, it was many years ago, but I'll always remember this. This was an election of 1988. And I was teaching a class for Houston Community College, Southwest Houston. And I had a student who was really excited about the election. He had just turned 18, it was his first time to vote. And the day after the election, he always wanted to talk every day about it, right? The day after the election, I said, oh, hey, did you vote? How'd it go? And I could tell immediately he was depressed or dejected or whatever. Just his body language. I said, what's wrong? And he said, well, I went to go vote in the Democratic Party primary. My father told me to go vote in the Democratic Party primary. Apparently his father knew one of the candidates for sheriff. And he wanted him to go vote for that. But what he was really so excited about was he wanted to vote for George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, right, the older Bush. And so he voted in the Democratic Party primary, and then he described it to me almost exactly the way I just described it to him. So I went to go vote in the Democratic Party primary, voted for sheriff, and then I went over to the Republicans and I said, you can't vote here, you've already voted in the Democratic Party primary. And that was his whole
Experience.
reason for me. The whole
So you
reason.
can never go back.
He was so sad, you know, that his first experience. And I said, well, if you had listened closer in class when we were talking about closed primaries, you would have known that.
Just rub salt.
So wait, someone wanted him to vote for the Democratic, so he went to vote Democratic, then he went to vote Republican, and they were like, no.
Because it was a closed primary.
Because it's a closed primary. Now, most states have a closed primary. The authors of your textbook tell you that the Texas primary is an open primary, but I disagree with their assessment a little bit. I'm going to tell you that the Texas primary is really a semi-closed primary.
Wait,
And if that sounds like a,
So is it on a county basis?
no, it's on a statewide basis. The two criteria for a closed primary are you have to declare a party affiliation and you can only vote in one of the two parties primary. as I just said. Now, that, both of those things are true in Texas. What's not true in Texas is you don't have to declare a party affiliation ahead of time. In some states, you have to do it ahead of time. For example, all of that in Arizona, back in the 1980s. Back in the 1980s, it may still be true this in Arizona. It's been too long ago, I don't know, right? But when I registered to vote in Arizona, you had to declare a party affiliation at the time that you registered to vote. Right? And you would get your voter registration card in the mail,
It would tell.
and it would say Democrat, right, or Republican. And so that kind of bound you to that party's primary, right?
Yeah.
And made it more difficult. In
Okay.
Texas, there's a spot on your voter registration certificate for a party, but it's not filled in. Okay, they used to stamp it, as I said, but you can switch from one election year to the next. One year you can vote in the Republican primary, and the next time you can vote in the next election cycle, you can vote in the Democratic Party primary. So it's semi-close, right? It's just, in the business about declaring affiliation is not as, it's just not as pronounced as it is in some of the other states, okay? Now, in an open primary, there's a handful of states that have those. You can only vote in one of the two, but they have some mechanism in place that keeps it secret, like you're not declaring a party affiliation. I'm not sure exactly how that would work in a given state, but presumably you might be presented with both ballots, but you can only vote one of them. Only you would know which one you voted. A blanket primary, which is the independent voter's dream come true, I think is only used in one state anymore. It used to be, there was two states a number of years ago, but I think if I, unless I missed something in the news over the last 5, 6, 7 years or something like that, only Louisiana has a blanket primary. So in Louisiana, in a given election cycle, you can vote for a Republican for president. If it's a presidential election year, you can vote for a Democrat for governor. You can vote for a Republican for U.S. senator, right? You can go as an independent. Okay.
I like
In
that.
other words, both Democratic candidates and Republican candidates are on the same ballot. Yeah, independents do love that.
Yeah.
Okay, partisans don't love it.
No, like,
Right.
one party.
Well, think about it. If you're a partisan, if you're like a strong Republican, and you agree with the Republican Party's philosophy on a broad range of issues, the last thing that you want are independents or weak party identifiers coming in to your party's process and having an effect on who your nominees are. You want to make sure that the people that you nominate, if you're a strong Republican, you want to make sure the people that you nominate, your party nominates, are also strong Republicans and not wishy-washy independents. Right? That's the way a strong partisan would look at it. And the same thing for Democrats. People who are strong Democrats, they don't like the idea of independent voters getting in. There are some classic examples of how the primaries, the direct primaries, have resulted in candidates being nominated by a party that, if not openly hostile to the party's platform, or at least problem candidates for the party. Huh? Who?
No, I'm saying that's true.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's some really good, sort of stuff. How many of you ever heard the name David Duke? Anybody ever heard the name David Duke? What do you know about David Duke?
Wait, is he young?
No, not anymore.
Okay.
There he was at one time. David Duke ran for the Republican nomination for governor of Louisiana back in the early 1990s. Now, so what, you say? Well, he had been previously the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, well, all right.
He actually won the Republican nomination.
And they knew he was the grand.
Yeah, it wasn't a secret.
Oh,
Wow.
okay, yeah.
He actually won the Republican nomination. He didn't win the general election. The Democrat won the general election, but he actually won. Now, Republicans, particularly national Republicans like the president George H.W. Bush at the time, were scrambling to disavow him. He may say he's a Republican,
He's not a Republican.
we don't consider him a Republican.
So, like, now, get them out of the party.
Yeah.
We're not associating with
It's
them.
not that easy to get somebody out of the
He was
party.
nominated.
Right? He was nominated, that's right. The Democrats have their versions of that too, you know, maybe not a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, but they've had historically some real nut jobs that have, you know, a guy named Lyndon LaRouche, for example, who was a perennial Democratic candidate for president, and ran a presidential campaign out of his federal prison cell.
Okay.
But the main issue with him was his supporters. The people who supported Lyndon LaRouche were actually getting nominations, Democratic Party nominations for local offices and statewide offices in places like Illinois and other places around the country. So that's one of the problems with the primary, particularly open primaries and certainly blanket primaries, where you can get people who come in to the party who may not be exactly, you know, dyed in the wool Republicans, as they like to say, or you know, tried and true Democrats. Okay, we're out of time. We'll just have to leave it at that. A lot more that we should have talked about, but that's all right. We'll move on to new stuff next week.